Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Anya Kivarkis, Associate Professor of Jewelry and Metalsmithing at the University of Oregon. Kivarkis has exhibited her work widely and has garnered numerous awards, including individual artist fellowships from the Oregon Arts Commission in 2008 and 2014. Kivarkis' work is included in such collections as the Tacoma Art Museum, the Samuel Dorsky Museum of Art, the Rotassa Foundation, and the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. She is represented by the Siena Gallery in Lenox, Massachusetts, and the Gallery Rob Koudijs in the Netherlands. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're a jeweler. How did you come to be one?
Well, let's see. So when I was really young, I used to make beaded jewelry, which is probably what brings the majority of the people to the field, but that was really informal. And when I went to undergraduate school at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, I first was in the humanities, actually studying sociology and trying to avoid having an art practice, which is maybe a funny way of avoiding it. So I moved into the art department, and I think I always understood that that was where I would land when I started in painting, and eventually just really fell in love with the studio and the practices that were embedded in the field of jewelry and metalsmithing, and I think it just kind of kept me there. And actually, I was a fourth-year undergraduate when I switched my major, so it took me 6 years to complete the degree, which was really worthwhile.
So you have a BFA as from undergraduate, and then where did you do your MFA?
At the State University of New York in New Paltz, which is a really great jewelry and metalsmithing program. And
you did some work as a jeweler, right? I mean, between that, or you worked in Chicago as a jeweler?
I worked in Chicago as a jeweler, and I also taught at a community college after undergraduate school, or a teacher's college, Chicago State, which is in Chicago, which was a really great experience also.
So you've been called a conceptual jeweler. So is that a term that you think is a legitimate term, and if you do, why are you? Why is it make sense to call you a conceptual jeweler?
Yeah, I would say the field of jewelry and metalsmithing is really, as embedded within the practices of art, is really different than the field of jewelry as it is understood in a really vernacular way. It's definitely informed by that kind of context of material culture, and I think that's really important. But I think the work is about ideas that, and also to say the work is jewelry, so it's jewelry that exists as jewelry for the most part. That's shifting a little bit now, which I'll probably talk about later. But it's jewelry that exists as jewelry, but it's also simultaneously about jewelry, so I think that's the difference. It's not just jewelry, it's about being jewelry also.
I know you consider yourself a researcher as well, and that you do a lot of research in archives. Mm-hmm. Why is archival research important to your project, to your process?
One of the ways that I started doing that research was for my first solo exhibition, which was titled Blind Spot at Siena Gallery. I was looking at the history of jewelry and realizing how minimal the research was in that context. Mm-hmm. So I started so here's maybe the aboutness comes into play here. Maybe less about being about the specific histories that are embedded in the field. It's about the idea of maybe this lack of history. So I would look at Victorian photographs and also look at Baroque prints, like drawings of jewelry from the Baroque period, and realizing that those objects don't exist anymore, because in the Baroque period, fashion was shifting so quickly that the jewelry was melted and recycled. So those objects don't exist anymore. The only record of them is a print or an image. So I started reconstructing pieces of jewelry from those images, and maybe where parts of the image were unclear, I would interrupt the form with a blank cube or a blind spot. And so, just looking at the ways that those images and photographs became surrogates for history became really interesting to me, and maybe trying to recoup this history from those traces was what I started to pursue.
But you weren't actually making reproductions of the jewelry. You were making reproductions of representations of the jewelry.
Yes.
So what you couldn't see in the paintings, you did not. You substituted blank spaces or blocks in those spaces. So there's a kind of uncanny resemblance to the actual thing, because if there was a shadow, it would just be a blank on your reproduction.
Right. No,
Why Why reproduce representations? Why not just reproduce the objects themselves?
Because I think that what I want the work to be is about being a representation of a representation. So I think at some point so maybe moving forward, I started with working from images in the Baroque period, from prints, and then working from photographs in the Victorian period, and then shifted to photographs from paparazzi images of celebrities on the red carpet. So moving from the Baroque to the Victorian to our contemporary moment. And and that strategy of reproducing the object with whatever was not visible to me, left intact, became a strategy that's carried through from 2007 until today. So remind me, ask that question again.
Why is it important to reproduce representations? Why not just reproduce? I mean, if you were not an academic jeweler and metalsmither, you were just somebody who worked, in the Diamond District in Manhattan. And you were going to say, "Oh, I'm going to reproduce this ring that Winona Ryder wore, and here it is. You can own the ring she wore, right?" I'm sure that there are, I don't know, companies that do that, right?
Of course, yeah.
So, but that's not what you're doing.
Not at all.
So why do you do this other thing?
Yeah.
Why is that important?
So because the work is about the distance between the image and reality. Because I'm really interested in that optic quality of the image, or that experience is shaped by a stream of media images. So actually, for example, the Winona Ryder ring. I did make a reproduction of a Winona Ryder ring from internet images of the object on her body. And I found 3 images that were partial views. And I reconstructed each partial view of the object. And so had these 3 fragments that were and when I reproduce the object too, I reproduce it with the obstructions of her body left intact in the object. So if her hand is blocking a part, I block that part of the object, or I render it in perspective, which is an optic strategy translated into a haptic object. So it has all of these mutations that come from that translation of being from a representation. And then I took, thinking about the format of the internet, and that the images are kind of streaming, they're fragmentary, they're snapshots, they're linear, or not linear, they're just sort of moving through time in a particular way that's really ephemeral and maybe unstable. I took those 3 fragments and compiled them into a single object, sort of just stuck them together, and that became the replica. So it's not a true replica, but a replica with all of the confusion of translation embedded in the replica itself.
So there's a couple of questions that come from that I want to ask you. The first is you use the terms optic and haptic. Probably most of our viewers are familiar with the term optic. They may not know the word haptic. What does haptic mean? And when you're talking about this distinction, why is it important for you?
It's so interesting. Because I think, this is really interesting related to the field of jewelry metalsmithing, especially related to the way I'm even teaching it in the art department. I feel like people, and students specifically, are not as aware of materiality and physicality as maybe historically we were. And I don't mean to say that in a blanket way, but I do see this reality kind of evolving. And so the work, it's really important to me that the work is a thing, and it has all of its thingness embedded in it. So when I look at images, and maybe a good example, I made a piece that was called Laura Linney, Red Carpet, 2008, I think that one was from that time. And this is maybe the first replica I made from paparazzi images. And when I reproduced it, I just was reproducing the thing at first with silver. I would carve jewels and set them in prongs and accumulate this object in that way. And it felt totally like a replica at first, and I was like, this is not what I want to do, like what am I making? And then I started looking at the conditions of the media format and understanding the crop of the frame of the object. So I cut off the object, and it became kind of like, I kind of amputated a part of it off, and it was like part of this unknowable whole, but it had a certain kind of realness to it that was different than just being this replica of something else. So and then I also started to try to accumulate the glare in the photograph by adding more jewels on top of the object itself. And as I added more jewels, what happened in the real object is it became blurry instead of glaring. And to me, that became really interesting, that like it's impossible to translate from an image to an object and to apply optics to a thing, because optics are 2-dimensional things, and things are three-dimensional and four-dimensional. So that like impossibility of translation became really interesting to me, and that in some ways is the crux of the work.
And haptic is from the word that means touch, so the thing itself.
Yes, the materiality. And yeah, there's another project that maybe I can talk about later. It's a more current project.
So the second question that flows from that question I asked a little while ago was, you said Baroque period, Victorian period, and the contemporary period. Why those three periods? What's important about those particular historical moments for you?
Yeah, I was looking at periods where there was moments of imperialism, moments of accelerated consumption simultaneously, and especially, I also did a show called September issue was at Gallery Rob Koudijs that was looking at, and maybe this is a really good example of this, that it was looking at Vogue's September issue of 2007, which was its most infamous issue. There's a documentary related to it also, but its most infamous issue, largest issue, most about desire in some way. And it was released at the beginning of the global financial crisis, and to me that's such an incredible, bizarre, problematic way that we exist in terms of desire, or our relationship to desire. So, and then within that issue, I found a spread that was situated in the Roaring Twenties, which again was incredible to me. I mean, this is in some ways all strategic too, on the part of Vogue, maybe in some ways. Just looking at the Roaring Twenties, also this moment of accelerated consumption that precedes the Great Depression. So I took the pieces of jewelry that were really elaborate in that spread and reproduced them in the ways that I've been talking about. But
talk a little bit about the relationship between form and function in your work. So I know, for example, there's a couple of pieces where these are from the Baroque show where the painting has the sitter at an angle and the jewelry sort of comes out from under clothes, so there's this sort of a fragment of a necklace. And when you look at that and you think, oh, a fragment of a necklace, that's nice to look at. But your work's also, even if they're, this ring, the Winona Ryder ring, it's like 3 rings, it's this giant, you can wear that. And all of your jewelry, as I understand it, you can wear. So tell me about how you understand the difference between form and function in this project and in your work.
If I think about it in an expanded way related to the field of art, I would think about it as its site, and that really the body is the site for a lot of the work that I've produced until this point. So part of what's interesting to me is, yes, reproducing something in perspective, but then also putting something in perspective onto the body, and that the body and the object are in 2 different kind of frames of reference, or 2 different points of view, so that when you look at me frontally, if I'm wearing the thing, we're mismatched. But if I turn in a 3/4 view, we might look like we're in the same point of view. So there's something really amazing to me about perceiving related to these objects, and that the body becomes the site, and the contingency of the object moving through space is activated by being on the body.
Another interesting, I think, related piece is that there are some pieces where what is the front of the piece that you've created is blank, but the back of the piece that would be turned into the body, is highly ornate. What about that? How does that?
Yeah, so that work was maybe, and I don't do that anymore as a strategy, but I was really interested in just the simple idea of withholding something that might be the most elaborate or the most ornamental. So that piece specifically, and there's a couple, but one piece I replicated a Victorian object from a photograph, and I crafted it, and then I sandblasted it to give it this almost industrial surface, which conflicted with its methodology of production, which was crafted. And then I just flipped it backwards, so the front of the object was blank, but they're kind of lifted away from the body too. So there's some space behind the object it's just floating. So you can kind of start to catch a glimpse of it from an askew point of view. And then that evolved. I think the last time I did that was maybe 2007.
So I know that you've talked in interesting ways about the desire to erase the bling, and you do these reproductions of representations of jewelry that have jewels in them, but your work has no jewels in it, right? And you alluded, as you said, you carve them. First of all, why is it important to erase the bling? And second of all, you carve them? Tell a little bit about your technique.
My methodology is very crazy, I think, especially right now in this moment. So the objects, if you look at them, they're accumulations of thousands or hundreds of jewels and thousands of connections between them. So I'll take a rod of metal and literally file the top of it to look like facets, and then cut it off, and then repeat, and cut it off, and repeat. And that's how I accumulate. And I have, at the end of really long durations of work, I have these tiny piles of jewels in my studio.
Well, they're jewels, right?
Jewels, yes, they're images of jewels. So what interests me about those is to take silver, which is a material of value, but it has a certain kind of luster. But to take that and to carve it, and it has this sort of shininess, but not like the same as a jewel. It's not refracting in the same way. And then after I make all of the work, I do tend to sandblast it. So sandblasting is really like beads of sand hitting the surface to deaden it. So I am interested in this replica that has all this luster that then gets this overall surface that deadens the object. So it becomes part alive and part dead and part lustrous and part like not glaring at all. Yeah.
You also, I know, will sometimes like take these somewhat shiny objects and dip them in automobile paint. So they're like covered. So anything that resembles shiny is now gone. So talk a little bit more about this desire for deadness. Where does that come from?
I think it's a desire to obliterate, and I think different strategies obliterate in different ways. So the ones that I dip, sometimes I do dip them in a shiny white paint, actually. So those were earlier works too. Those were maybe objects that existed between being hyper modern and hyper ornamental. So these weird hybrid objects that were between maybe a Victorian idea of progress and a modernist one. And then other objects were from Baroque drawing. So I would paint them with auto paint and then matte the paint so it almost looked like paper, and I would take steel and burnish on the facets of the object so it looked like a drawing and a thing at the same time. So that was maybe the first time I thought about representation in that way. And then now mostly constructing them from silver and then just putting an overall dead sandblasting over them. I've also spray painted with gold, so it's like silver that's spray painted with glamour, but it's such a trashy skin of it because it's just gold paint that's in the wrong hue.
I know that, you just described this incredibly intensive work that you're doing. You're talking about, you're using sandblasting and so forth, and there's an interest in sleek modernist design at the same time that there's this. But you're also really committed to that your work shows the evidence of the hand of the artist. Why is that important?
I think so. I recently did a collaborative exhibition with my partner, Mike Bray, and it was at Innova, which is in Milwaukee, Institute of Visual Art. And it was related to related to jewelry and cinema. We were looking at To Catch a Thief and Last Year at Marienbad, but the project isn't necessarily limited to those films. And so I had this idea that I wanted to take a piece of jewelry from that film, to Last Year at Marienbad, and there's a scene in the film where there's a performance and the viewers are watching the performance, and that film is specifically about the apparatus of cinema and looking at the methodology of that and maybe breaking it down to understand that in a different way. And so looking at that, and it's very slow, and these people wearing jewelry and they're just breathing, and I wanted to isolate that breathing jewelry on those bodies. And so my partner, who works in film and video and installation art, he edited everything out of that frame, and we had that piece of jewelry just breathing on a body. But it had, what we edited out of the show, we wanted a series of, several of these all facing the same direction, just breathing pieces of jewelry on black screens. And we edited that out because, in a way, and I think for me this was really interesting because I've always worked in the format of the jewelry going back onto the body. And in this context, it started to become installation and spatial in a different way. And so what I realized from that was that there is some quality that comes from reproducing the thing, where there's a tension in the object that's accumulated over time through bits of material that are accumulated into an object. And it has this kind of this weird tension as an object, and also I can make it in a way that's really, there's a crispness to the object, and I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like really clear that it's really important to make the object. So a next project that I'm working on is for a Portland biennial that was curated by Michelle Grabner, related to the gallery Disjecta, and I'm going to make those objects and film a body breathing with these jewelry objects on it. And I just want to understand the difference between appropriating a strip of film and making a thing from that film and filming it. You know, the two different methodologies and what each can render.
Earlier you implied that this new project is going to be extremely time consuming.
Every project.
Oh, it's extremely time consuming. They're all, okay.
They're all.
I understand. Yeah. So you are you're a conceptual jeweler, but you're also a professor of art.
Yeah.
And so you teach jewelry making and metalsmithing. How would you characterize your approach as a teacher?
In so many ways, what would I say? You know, I feel like my students, they change all the time. I feel like there's something really interesting about how they shift, and I respond to what they're interested in thinking about in some ways, but the core of the program, you know, it's important to teach them, and this is maybe the struggle, like to teach them how to make things, but obviously not to land in a space of becoming any kind of trade school. Like, how do you embed that in an art department, first of all, where there's a, you know, difference between ways that art and craft are approached. So that's one question. And then also within the larger university, how does that become a critical inquiry? And how do they do research? You know, how can a student research and learn to make in particular ways? And, you know, so there's a lot of things that I'm trying to synthesize all at the same time. Yeah, and I can get more specific as we go on, or I could just talk on and on and on.
Well, let me ask you this. You've just described sort of the things that you try to do with or for them.
Yeah.
What do they give you?
You know, my students, they can be so wonderful. You know, this term specifically, they've been so challenging in a way that was frankly really frustrating in the beginning of the term. They're different than students I've had in the past. And you know, I actually watched William Deresiewicz, is that how to pronounce his lecture on what's the Oregon Humanities Center lecture on, you know, what's college for. And it really, that lecture specifically flipped my perception of them, and I realized there's a way in which maybe it represents some disconnect between my idea of craft and their idea of craft. Like, I think there's a rupture right now in education, even my idea of art and their idea of art. So watching that lecture made me realize that being inclusive, or like finding what being inclusive means right now, is actually something I need to do. So I felt like the challenge became much more interesting after watching that. And
what's the difference between do you think the difference between your understanding of craft and their understanding of craft? You
know, these students that I have right now, many of them are non-traditional students. So there's a way in which they are really interested in making, but maybe, and this does not go for all of them actually, but some of them had a kind of traditional notion of craft, that they wanted to make stuff and maybe didn't want to think as critically about it. But then other students that are younger have a different way, like they're very uncomfortable with making stuff at all. So I have maybe it's just that I have such a broad range of students and they're coming from so many different perspectives. And to me, that idea is actually, I just love the idea that I have to figure out how to wrangle with that. Yeah.
You've been at the University of Oregon since 2004. What keeps you here?
You know, that's a good question. I started as visiting faculty. I thought I was just coming for 1 year. There were not, I am from such a small field, there weren't jobs for many years. And fortunately, the position was open as visiting for many years. And as I stayed, I feel really increasingly challenged by my department and by my colleagues. And I think, I just feel like it's a good match in terms, and maybe specifically in this way. I think a lot of programs that have craft programs embedded within them are breaking off, and the craft program is becoming its own thing and the art department something else. But I'm really interested in struggling with how to locate craft within the art department and within a broader institution that has the humanities, for example. So my students are taking classes in sociology and they bring that information and thinking about a kind of object in material culture. You know, they're broader in a way here, I think, than being at an art school. So I feel like that keeps me here. The students, the breadth, the struggling with how to locate the practice of craft here, I think is really all very engaging.
Is there any place now at this very moment or in the near future where our viewers could go see some of your work? Anything on display anywhere?
In Oregon?
Well, I don't know. Tell me. I mean, it's possible that people could conceivably be watching this all over the world.
Right.
So,
oh yes, of course. Okay.
We have hundreds of thousands of viewers across the entire.
I was watching this in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Well, I have a piece in the collection of the Jordan Schnitzer, so that's one thing, and sometimes that's on view. Mike, my partner, and I have a show at Innova, which is in Milwaukee, and I will have work in the Portland Biennial at the White Box Gallery. Actually, is where I've been placed.
White Box Gallery in the White Stag Block. That's UO Portland. And when will that be?
That will be in July.
July
in the
of
beginning
this year.
of July. Yeah, just a month and a half. Yeah.
Okay, so last question.
Yeah.
Are there any artists that are making work right now that you are like totally jazzed by and you want to share with our viewers? Other artists,
Yeah, there's so many.
I'll just choose
Yeah,
first
I
one
could
that comes to
say
your mind.
Philippe Pereno, I'm really interested in. Banks Violet. I'm interested in people who are thinking about maybe glamour in a certain way, or sort of like heightened glamour that's falling apart at the same time that it's, extremely glamorous. So.
Yeah, so heightened glamour that's falling apart at the same time. This must be your moment. You're like waking up every day, turning on the television. It's awesome, right?
It's really sad.
So it's, well, Anya, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Anya Kivarkis, Associate Professor of Jewelry and Metalsmithing at the University of Oregon. Thank you so much for watching.